Hello students. It is said that if the lamp of justice goes out in darkness, how great that darkness is. Indeed, that is no less true when it comes to the whole question of social justice in India. India, we know, is a land of diversity, but this diversity assumes an extremely complicated and complex form in India because major segments of the population have suffered injustice down the ages because of stigmas for which there is no rationality. And that brings us to the issue of social justice. Indian society is underlined by diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity, religion, and language. But amidst this diversity, there exists a centuries-old stigma of caste discrimination, creating a hierarchical relationship among the communities belonging to different castes with social inequality at its base. This notion of inequality has brought to the forefront the need for accomplishment of social justice. Although the word social justice has not been explicitly defined anywhere in the Constitution, a reflection of it is available in the preamble as well as in the chapters on fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy enshrined in the Constitution of India. So how does social justice get emphasized in the preamble? Every constitution, we know, has a philosophy of its own. The preamble proclaims that the resolution of people of India to constitute into a sovereign, socialist, secular and democratic republic and to secure to all citizens justice, social, economic and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. The phrase social justice in the preamble implies recognition of the greater good of a larger number without deprivation of their legal rights. The pursuit of social justice as a phenomenon to reduce discrimination gathered momentum in the second half of the 20th century. It is spurred by a concern arising from the observed fact that society is not a level playing field. It does not provide rights and opportunities for a considerable section of the individuals who are subjected to discrimination in one form or another. The quest for social justice necessitates some form of affirmative action. Some kind of intervention is imperative if the social injustice is to be reversed. As Aristotle pointed out, it is equally against equality to treat unequals equally and equals unequally. So, why is affirmative action necessary? Even the architect of the Indian Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, who played a vital role to ensure that the affirmative action policy was constitutionally mandated, did not perceive affirmative action as a panacea for all the social ills that resulted in discrimination in Indian society. For him, the caste system meant a state of slavery, a society in which some men are forced to accept from others the purposes which control their conduct. Hence, he was engaged in the propagation of strategies and instruments to annihilate the caste system altogether. He wanted to do away with caste entirely. On the other hand, there are scholars who consider affirmative action to be a necessity, even if it is not a sufficient policy in the quest for social justice. Thus, it is widely believed to be important for increasing the representation of disadvantaged groups, although one cannot be sure whether it would lead to overall reduction in inequality or not. So, what is the case for affirmative action that is based on the issue of caste? The constitution of newly independent India continued the idea of preferential politics and policies, declared untouchability illegal, and espoused the ideal of a casteless society. But even after so many years of reservation policy, Indian society continues to be characterized by a high degree of structural inequalities based on the institutions of caste and ethnicity. And this is what is really important to consider, that despite the fact that reservation has been in place for so many years, the discrimination that is repulsive in Indian society continues without much change. Although every caste, except those at the top of the hierarchy, suffers from the unequal and hierarchical assignment of rights, it is the untouchables referred to officially as the scheduled castes which have actually suffered the most. So what is the kind of exclusion which is suffered by scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India? Historically, they were denied the right to property, business, and all civil, cultural, and religious rights except manual labor and services to castes above them. Untouchables also suffer from residential segregation and social isolation. In fact, these are dehumanizing aspects of civilization, something at the sight of which our heads should hang in shame, that a human being should be so degraded and mistreated even in civilized societies. Another source of exclusion is linked with ethnic identity, from which groups like the Adivasis, meaning indigenous, referred to as the scheduled tribes, suffer. This group has suffered from isolation, exclusion, neglect, and underdevelopment due to their geographical and cultural isolation. In their case, exclusion can take several forms, including the denial of the right to resources around which they live and displacement induced by economic development. As if they are pawns who can be sacrificed at the altar of development which the Indian state aspires for. So, there is need for affirmative action, okay, particularly in view of the intercaste disparities that continue to plague our society even after so many years of independence. First, let us highlight the systematic intercaste disparities. Data from a variety of sources on material standards of living, poverty rates, health status, educational attainment, and occupational outcomes indicate that the disparities between the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes on the one hand and the other non-backward categories or classes are persistent and systematic, regional variations notwithstanding. There is also tremendous social discrimination. There is sufficient evidence that amply demonstrates that various aspects of stigmatization, exclusion, and rejection that Dalits continue to face in contemporary India. Satyajit Ray's film Sadgati is a case in point, which illustrates this in a very sharp manner. In rural India, despite the breakdown of the traditional subsistence economy, caste continues to exert its strong presence in many different dimensions. Untouchability is not only present all over rural India, but it has survived by adapting to new socioeconomic realities and taking on new and insidious forms. Studies have documented various types of untouchability practiced by the non-Dalits over the Dalits. For instance, tea stalls keep separate cups for Dalit customers, which they have to wash themselves. Not buying milk or vegetables from Dalit vendors. Making Dalit children sit separately even in a school and at the back of the classroom in schools and so on. Absolutely dehumanizing and degrading. Coupled with economic discrimination, which we see in the wages. For instance, average wages for scheduled castes and others differ across all occupation categories. The fact that the two groups enter the labor market with substantial differences in educational levels indicates pre-market discrimination. There is plenty of evidence which documents the substantial gaps between scheduled castes and others in access to education, quality of education, access to resources that could enhance learning, and also of active discrimination inside the school by the teachers. Such pre-market discrimination ensures that outcomes will necessarily be unequal even if there is no active labor market discrimination. The evidence on persistence of caste-based economic discrimination in rural areas is perhaps not as surprising as the evidence from urban areas, especially in the modern formal sector jobs. So one has to be careful to notice that economic discrimination is visible not only in rural settings, which we have talked about, but also in urban settings. In rural areas, individuals are more easily identified by their caste status and presumably are more inclined to pursue caste-based occupations given the correspondingly lower spread of the modern formal economy. Caste is supposed to be anonymous in urban settings, by contrast. But several studies confirm, and this is really illuminating, that in appointment of recruits for jobs where supposedly merit is the only consideration, discrimination based on caste continues in disguise. There are studies of hiring practices which emphasize the role of networks and that of informal and personalized recruitment, where who you know is often more important than what you know. So the question is how to address economic discrimination in the private sector. In view of the unambiguous evidence on discrimination, affirmative action becomes essential to guarantee representation to Dalits in preferred positions. It should be noted, however, that affirmative action in India, which is also another name for reservation, due to the specific forms it takes, is not a complete remedy for discrimination because it is deep-rooted and age-old. If not for any other reason than the fact that affirmative action is applicable only to the public sector, whereas the evidence of discrimination is overwhelmingly from the private sector, which is becoming increasingly important in the Indian economy. So there has to be some compensation for historical wrongs. Affirmative action is necessary because social policy ought to compensate for the historical wrongs of a system that generated systematic disparity between caste groups and actively kept untouchables at the very bottom of the social and economic order. This argument has been used forcefully in certain international contexts also, for instance in Australia for the stolen generation and in South Africa for the injustice done to blacks during apartheid. A word of caution, however, is necessary about the concept or the very idea of historical wrongs. For a region marked by waves of migration over centuries, it is not clear who is the original inhabitants of the region. Thus, the definition of historical wrongs is fraught with controversy. With regard to the gross violations against particular castes resulting from centuries of untouchability, the argument of compensation for historical wrongs could be and has been used as one of the elements in the case for affirmative action. However, the case for affirmative action as a compensation for contemporary exclusion is just as strong, even if one did not view it as a necessary remedy for historical exclusion. So what are the major debates over affirmative action? Quotas are seen widely as unfair and are condemned for punishing innocent upper caste for the damage done in the past, reinforcing caste lines rather than striving for a caste-free society, and for exempting Dalits from the rigors of market competition. Critics argue that reservations replace one form of discrimination against Dalits by another, especially when it comes to equally pernicious form against the general category students of workers. To them, affirmative action amounts to reverse discrimination. There is a view, especially among the upper castes, that they are benefiting a generation whose parents have already moved up in the social structure and have been able to give them benefits denied to other much poorer and more remote young people. There is also belief that unqualified students are displacing highly qualified students in the race to the top of the educational pyramid. But let us also be conscious of the perspective of those who have been wronged, and they have been wronged in no uncertain ways for centuries. Broadly speaking, Dalits find all these arguments against reservation rather misplaced. They instead argue that the most powerful special privileges accrue to high caste Hindus who can tap into exclusive social networks, bank on the cultural capital of their families bequeathed to them, or pay the bribes that are demanded by employers for access to jobs. In other words, the race begins from very unequal points. It's like asking a lame man and an able-bodied man to run a race from the same line in the name of equality. And that is what the Dalits want to sensitize us to. Dalits from remote areas see themselves as doubly disadvantaged, one by caste bias and second by poverty. They struggle out of rural areas burdened by social isolation, ill-equipped in terms of cultural capital to navigate in an urban metropolis or the national capital, for they lack social networks that more privileged castes often count on. They have been handicapped from the beginning. So affirmative action is a necessary piece of social engineering. Quotas in higher education, so argue Dalit voices, not only enable the ascent of Dalits in the university world, but also allow them to articulate their interests and enable them to access the core of society where they can meet other people and find a platform and an audible voice for themselves. Introducing them to another world and a different future breaks the silence imposed by marginality, caste prejudices, particularly if you consider the targeted violence against Dalits, such as beating, rape of Dalit women, destruction of their assets, murder, and so on, particularly all that goes on in the rural areas, and of course the scourge of poverty which has inflicted them from so long. For Dalit students, the reservations policy is nothing more than a form of social engineering designed to address centuries of oppression and discrimination, extreme inequalities in the distribution of educational opportunity, and the formation of a huge class of Indian citizens who are not equipped to compete without this much needed assistance. So reservations will be necessary as long as human dignity is imperiled. And that is what we have seen because of the dreaded scourge of the stigma imposed by the caste system. Dalits cite countless examples from their own experience where they have been interrogated about their caste identities, subjected to harassment or disrespect, and denied jobs solely on account of their caste background. In short, their capabilities are stunted by this assault on their sense of human dignity, which everyone has a right to. In fact, Martha Nussbaum considers human dignity, along with Amartya Sen, to be a basic and a vital human right that needs to be respected irrespective of time and place. As long as this injustice persists, they argue, reservations will be needed. The policy levels the playing field at the vital choke points of social mobility. There is also the question of access of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes to the institutions of justice. What remedy do they have if they face injustice, which they always do in various walks of life? An issue relates to the access of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes to the institutions of justice in seeking protection against discrimination. Studies indicate that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are generally faced with unsurmountable obstacles in their effort to seek justice in the event of discrimination. Legal truth is, after all, not political truth. The data on civil rights cases, for example, shows that only 1.6% of the total cases registered in 1991 were convicted, and this has fallen to 0.9% in 2000. A study in Andhra Pradesh about the reasons for low conviction observed negligence and collusion at the stage of registration, charge sheeting and investigation, in seeking justice before the law in court, and also in giving compensation. And of course, we have this nebulous concept of merit. We say that all appointments are based on merit. But what exactly is merit? The most common criticism of affirmative action measures is that they go against the consideration of merit and efficiency by allowing candidates access to preferred positions in higher education and public sector jobs that would otherwise not have access. So what is merit, as I was mentioning? It should be noted as a general point that the discussion on merit is conducted as if merit is a neutral, objective characteristic independent of the standard used to measure it, similar to height or the weight of a person. Consequently, exam scores are a relatively uncontroversial instrument for allocating scarce seats in institutions for higher education. The reality is that merit is extremely hard to measure in a standardized way and examination results. While widely used as a proxy for merit may not be the best gauge, whether every percentage difference in examination scores reflects a qualitative difference in merit is a moot point. Marks don't prove merit. And there are those who have been handicapped from their past, as a result of which, in the present circumstances, how can they be expected to compete on equal terms? And so the whole question of merit pales into abstraction. Several researches document the long-term positive impact of affirmative action on the lives of beneficiaries who successfully graduate from elite universities, even if they do so with grades lower than their white counterparts. Before the more rigorous empirical studies came into existence, Galanter in 1984 had undertaken a rough but comprehensive assessment of the affirmative action program. What were Galanter's conclusions? Interesting, particularly when we consider the aspect of affirmative action for ensuring social justice in India. The program has shown substantial redistributive effects in that access to education and jobs is spread wider in the caste spectrum than earlier, although redistribution is uneven throughout the beneficiary groups. There is evidence of clustering, but Galanter believes that these reflect structural factors rather than a disproportionate share of the benefits in any government program, not just in affirmative action programs. The vast majority of Dalits are not directly affected by affirmative action, but reserved jobs bring a manifold increase in the number of families liberated from subservient roles, and that is a long way. In the short run, beneficiaries might get singled out and experience social rejection in offices, college hostels, and other setups where they are introduced through affirmative action. However, in the long run, education and jobs weaken the stigmatizing association of Dalits with ignorance and competence. So, ignorance and incompetence should not be used as tags with the Dalits, which is grossly unjust. Reserved seats do provide representation to scheduled caste, scheduled tribes in legislative bodies, but that may not get reflected in enhanced targeted policies towards these groups for several reasons. First, these candidates are elected by a common electorate, and hence scheduled caste, scheduled tribe candidates have to appeal to a wider multi-group electoral constituency and tailor programs accordingly. Second, these candidates typically belong to political parties which have a larger agenda than that of Dalit empowerment, which their elected representatives, including Dalits, have to reflect. Final conclusion of Galanter is that affirmative action has kept the beneficiary groups and their problems visible to the educated public. We are aware of the discrimination that Dalits are apt to face and be conscious of that, and in our own capacity as individual citizens, we can take small steps to address them and undo the injustice that is still visible. So it has not motivated widespread concern for their inclusion beyond what is mandated by the government policy. But there is no explicit affirmative action in college hostels. Affirmative action in colleges leads to entry of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe students in college hostels. Thus, Galanter concludes that affirmative action has been a partial, even though a costly success. It has accelerated the growth of a middle class, and scheduled caste and scheduled tribe members have been brought into central roles considered unimaginable a few decades ago. So, the impact of affirmative action has definitely been positive, and we appreciate its necessity as long as inequality and injustice continue to be persistent features of life in Indian society. Over time, there has been a considerable increase in the share of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in government employment and educational institutions. Reservations in the legislature have also provided a space for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes in the executive and in the decision-making process. The formal reservation policy in the governmental sector and the informal affirmative action policy in the private sector have also contributed to an improvement in the human development of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. However, the rate of improvement has been slow, and disparities in human development attainment between scheduled castes, scheduled tribes on the one hand, and non-scheduled castes and non-scheduled tribes on the other continue even today. During the course of the implementation of India's reservation policy, some problems have become apparent. First, its success has been uneven across sectors and departments. Generally speaking, participation of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes is close to their population shares in lower categories of jobs, but much lower than their shares in the high-grade positions. Due to indirect resistance, the extension and spread of reservation policy to several government sectors has also been slow. So, the second issue is the demand by the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes to extend formal affirmative action policy to private sector employment and private education institutions. This is currently under active consideration by the government. And finally, the fact that disparities in attainment persist even today indicates that addressing social exclusion is often a much more difficult challenge than addressing poverty issues. So we conclude that social and cultural sources of exclusion, including low self-esteem, stigma, discrimination, and denial of citizenship, are rooted in the social structure and the institutions of caste and untouchability in India. In this context, the inclusion of excluded groups becomes a somewhat different goal than the inclusion of materially deprived people. Even when broadly defined, poverty is still largely a question of access to resources and services. By contrast, exclusion of groups or of individuals within groups is foremost a denial of equal opportunity, respect, and the right to development, which affects even the relatively better of members of excluded groups. So, we should all work together hand in hand and contribute to affirmative action policies of the government to ensure that the social wrongs that have been done to people for so long are undone and reversed sooner than later. Thank you.